This program is brought to you by Byway Media, overseen by the elders of the Chipman Road Church of Christ in Lee Summit, Missouri.
Maybe it was maybe it was a natural disaster like we saw in the Carolinas with the flooding, wiping out homes and businesses that had stood for decades, suddenly and violently changing the landscape into something unrecognizable. Or perhaps it was something like, those living in the northern states, tornadoes wiping out towns is or was unthinkable because they don't live in Tornado Alley like I do here in Kansas, always waiting for the possible tornado, always expecting that sometimes it could happen, but not for them, not there. Or maybe it was the pandemic that was so out of our consciousness that we just never suspected. Or maybe the unthinkable is just a little more personal, like a disease that we prepared for with healthy eating, exercise, and doing every single thing right, living right. And still the unimaginable diagnosis of a disease or a loss happens. See, that's the problem. And that's the question. When the unthinkable happens, what do you think? What then? In Exodus chapter 1, it happened. Something that had never happened ever before in the history of mankind, in the history of the world. First, her people were slaves, working in all kinds of labor. And that had never happened before to God's people. Did you realize that? Never. But still they were blessed. God blessed them, and they worked hard, and they prayed to God for relief for over 400 years. They were mistreated just because they were blessed. And just when it didn't seem possible, life got worse, so much worse. And there it was, the unimaginable, the unthinkable, verse 22 of chapter 1 of Exodus. And Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who was born of the children of Israel, you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you're to keep alive. Can you imagine the sounds of mothers crying when that decree went out? The horrible sounds of grief and pain that came from their homes when they heard that their baby boys would be ripped from their arms and thrown into the Nile to drown. It was the first genocide of a people, the first mass murder grave, the Nile. Can you imagine the hearts of a woman who longed for a child and then heard this proclamation, this nightmare? Did they then pray that the child would not be a boy? Did they pray they would not have children at all? And when they gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, the fear, the unthinkable heartbreak, knowing its fate, a grave in the Nile. This is not the story that we tell about one mother's unthinkable journey to the Nile. We tell something different. But that account begins in chapter 2 of Exodus. No, we don't tell that story in our children's Bible classes. Instead, we hand out the color sheets for them to learn the mercy and the providence of a God who is always watching over us, who never forgets us when we are heartbroken and we feel without hope. We tell that story because we're looking back. Remember, we're not standing in the shoes of a mother who placed her child in a basket expecting, I believe, to never see him again, putting a basket with her baby boy in the reeds and walking away home with empty arms, hoping that someone somewhere might find him, someone far away, maybe outside of Egypt, or take him somewhere else where he would be safe, because that was the last place that he would be safe, in her arms. Instead, she hoped someone else would take him and raise him with love, because she was living the unthinkable. And it was unthinkable the answer to that. That Pharaoh's own daughter would find the child. Unimaginable that even though she knew that baby boy was a Hebrew child, she would have compassion on him. And she would step in and save him from the fate that the other Hebrew children endured and the heartbreak of the other mothers, mothers of the children who drowned in the river. Looking back at that, it just, it seems much less shocking, doesn't it? Once we've heard it again and again, and we read through it so many times, it was just a reality. To us, they're just facts. So we sing the songs about Moses, and we hand out the color sheets, and maybe even pretend to put a baby doll in a basket and act out the scene, gently pushing the basket in the river, and it becomes possible. It becomes thinkable because we see the end. We aren't the mama walking away from a basket floating in a river who had no assurance of anything, that anything would be different for her baby boy. Instead, we see Moses, grown, standing at the burning bush in chapter 3 with his sandals off. We hear him anger God with his doubt. Don't pick me. And then we see him on the mountain and speaking with God as a friend just 30 chapters later. We see the giant clusters of grapes and pomegranates and figs being carried on that pole out of the land God promised his people. Numbers chapter 11, verse 21 through 27. When they begged God for mercy and relief from that slavery. We see Moses dealing with a people who had been overwhelmed, beaten down long ago. A people who had lost their center. A people who had lost their trust in God's promises after all he did for them. They just couldn't wrap their minds around and see beyond that moment and that situation. They just couldn't. They were paralyzed in the unthinkable. But there's always something, isn't there? Something that, will shock us to the core when it happens because it was never on our radar. It was never possible. For Mrs. Noah, it was walking onto an ark when her husband told her that everything she knew would be destroyed by rain, something she had never seen, never imagined the concept of. And for Sarah, it was that she would have a child, conceive a child, after her body told her it was not possible. It was unthinkable, unimaginable. And for Naomi, it was maybe being abandoned in a land that was not her home. And then have her sweet daughter-in-law pledge her life to walk the lonely road home with her. And for Mary, it was being told she would carry the Messiah in her body and give birth to the hope of the world. And in each situation of theirs, each one unimaginable for them. Frightening for them? Well, yes. Overwhelming? Of course. And yet each became the reality. So what did they do when the unthinkable happened? What did they do then? Well, Jochebed, Moses' mother, put her baby in a basket covered with tar and pitch and put him in the reeds and walked away in faith and I believe with hope. And Mrs. Noah, she took her first step onto the ark, and then she took her steps walking off into a world she never imagined with faith, like Sarah in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11, and like Naomi, who walked through the bitterness with determination to build a family to fulfill the will of our God. And that is one of the most incredible things, the most incredible distinguishing factors of each one of them. It was their reaction to the unthinkable, the unimaginable, because that's what God's servants do. Yeah, there's always something unthinkable, isn't there? Unthinkable until it isn't any longer. And then that is all we can think about, all we can see. Unless we remember our view, it's limited. Our reality is not complete. And our Father's loving kindness remains consistent and the unthinkable. until we will be able to look back and we'll be able to see that He was always, through it all, He was always thinking of us all along. And it is for this, the unthinkable, the unimaginable, and His unwavering, steadfast goodness, that I bow my knees with you today.
We thank you for joining us today. We hope you have enjoyed this program. You can find out more about Bible Way Media by visiting us at BibleWayMedia.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find all of our podcasts on all major podcast platforms. As always, we thank you for listening.